Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into the Manson family murders today. You've sent us tons of research on this case, like biographies and psychological profiles, and honestly, I can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, it's
What is it about this case, even decades later, that still feels so relevant, so unsettling?
it's like holding a mirror up to the American dream, but instead of a reflection, you see this distorted, nightmarish version staring back. Manson weaponized the anxieties and desires of the late 60s, twisting the counterculture movement into something dangerous, even deadly.
Yeah, he wasn't just a murderer. He was a cult leader, a wannabe musician, this magnetic personality who built a following.
Yeah.
What was it about Charles Manson himself? His background seems pretty crucial here.
Absolutely. Manson's childhood was beyond troubled. An absent father, a mother who was in and out of his life, stints in juvenile detention that started when he was just a kid. Now, it's important to be clear, a horrific childhood doesn't create a monster, but understanding Manson's early trauma, how it warped his view of the world and his need for control, that's essential.
There's this unsettling detail in one of the books you shared that Manson, before the murders, was actually trying to break into the music scene, even had some minor connections to people like the Beach Boys.
Right.
Did that rejection, that thwarted ambition, fuel his rage?
There's definitely a sense that Manson craved recognition, control, maybe even a twisted sort of fame. And you can't ignore the irony. In the 60s, this era of peace and love also birthed this darkness. The music scene, especially the Beatles, became deeply entangled in Manson's psychosis.
Wait, the Beatles? How does that connect?
Manson fixated on their music, particularly the White Album. He believed it contained secret messages, prophecies about a coming apocalyptic race war that he called helter-skelter.
Okay, now that is chilling. Taking something as beautiful and creative as music and twisting it into a justification for everything that came next. But helter-skelter, that wasn't just some random phrase for Manson, was it?
Not at all. It formed the bedrock of his twisted philosophy. He believed this war was inevitable, and that by accelerating it, by instigating chaos and violence, he and his followers would emerge as rulers in the New World Order. His followers, many of them young and vulnerable, were completely indoctrinated with this belief system. They were isolated, their reality carefully curated by Manson.
That isolation, the control he had over their reality, it reminds me of other cults throughout history. Was that level of manipulation all about ideology, or were there other forces at play?
You can't separate Manson's control from the world he built at Spahn Ranch, this dilapidated movie set isolated on the outskirts of LA. On the surface, it had this veneer of utopian living, free love, communal harmony, but underneath it was suffocating.
It's like the ultimate manipulation, right?
Okay.
Create a world that seems idyllic, that fulfills these basic human needs for belonging and purpose, but then twist it, make it contingent on absolute obedience.
Exactly. And Manson was a master at exploiting those needs. He kept his followers completely dependent, limiting contact with the outside world, controlling their access to food and supplies.
So it's that classic cult tactic. Isolate them, make yourself the sole source of information, and then
Then you start to dismantle their reality. Manson would hold these marathon sessions, we're talking days at a time, where he'd lecture, rant, play music, all laced with this helter-skelter prophecy. It was like a form of brainwashing.
one of the articles you shared mentions that he specifically targeted young people, often runaways or those from broken homes. They were already vulnerable, searching for something to believe in, a place to belong.
Absolutely. And that's where the drugs come in. LSD wasn't just about getting high. It was a tool for breaking down defenses, for making his followers more susceptible to his suggestions. It blurred the lines between reality and delusion.
This one detail that stuck with me was about the creepy crawl. Manson would have his followers, often high on LSD, break into homes in LA, not to steal anything, but just to rearrange furniture, move things around.
It was about instilling the sense of paranoia, of unseen forces at play. He was conditioning them to see the world through his eyes, a world on the brink of collapse.
It's terrifying how calculated it all seems. It wasn't just about control for control's sake. It was about shaping them into instruments of his own twisted will.
Right. He was building his army, preparing them for that final, horrific act of helter-skelter.
Which brings us, of course, to those two nights in August of 1969, the Tate-LaBianca murders. I think it's important that we don't shy away from the details, no matter how disturbing they are. It's almost impossible to grasp the terror of those two nights. It wasn't random violence. Manson was trying to light the fuse of helter-skelter, to ignite that race war he kept predicting.
And the first target on August 8th was that home on Cielo Drive, a place already steeped in the aura of Hollywood.
Sharon Tate, a rising star, pregnant, married to director Roman Polanski. The brutality of her murder and the others in the house, it shocked even the most hardened investigators.
We tend to remember the famous names, but it's crucial to remember everyone who fell victim that night. Hairstylist J. Sebring Coffey heiress, Abigail Folger writer Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent, a young man who just happened to be visiting the property's caretaker.
And that word pig, written on the wall in blood. It wasn't just about the killings, was it? It felt like a message, a deliberate provocation.
Right. Manson had this whole theory that black revolutionaries would be blamed for the murders, which would then escalate into the race war he'd been preaching about. It's chilling how he used those murders as a twisted form of stage direction in his apocalyptic play.
And as if that wasn't horrific enough, the very next night, the LaBianca murders.
This time, Manson was more directly involved, driving to the house with his followers, entering the home himself. He wanted to make sure this act followed his specific instructions.
Like he was trying to send an even clearer message.
Exactly. Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were chosen in part because of their neighborhood, which Manson believed was in an area where black residents lived. The way they were killed, the messages left behind, "Death to pigs," carved into Lino's stomach, "Rise," scrawled on the wall. It was all designed to further incite racial tensions.
And what's striking is even as the details of these murders sent shockwaves across the country, the Manson family seemed almost untouchable.
They were masters of deception. They'd been living off the grid, committing petty crimes to fund their existence. It took months for investigators to connect the dots to uncover their hideout at Barker Ranch.
And the trial, it became this media spectacle. Manson, with his shaved head and that swastika carved into his forehead, he turned the courtroom into his own twisted stage.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Even facing the death penalty, his followers remained fiercely loyal. They echoed his every word, even carved X's into their foreheads to match his. It shows the depth of his hold over them.
So they were found guilty, sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. But where does that leave us? What can we truly learn from a case as horrific and complex as this?
You've hit on something crucial there, the learning. Yes, it's easy to dismiss Manson as a madman, a monster. But if we do that, we miss the bigger picture. The Manson family murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about manipulation, about the allure of belonging, about the dark potential that exists within us all.
We've only just scratched the surface of this case, but I hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, new insights, new questions to ponder. The Manson family murders aren't just a relic of the past. They're a stark reminder to stay vigilant, to think critically, and to never underestimate the human capacity for both